Let's cross over to Washington and say hello to Tomas Bilbao, Executive Director of the Cuba Study Group. Thank you for being with us here on France 24. You heard Chris Gillette say that there's rising expectations in Havana and that they could be dashed because things won't move as fast as the ordinary folks there think. How fast will things change?
Well, the only thing we can use as a point of reference is the actions taken by President Obama a few years ago when he expanded travel by family members to Cuba and remittances. And we've seen how those measures have greatly fueled the growth of Cuba's independent entrepreneurs, has helped reestablish ties between U.S. civil society and Cuban civil society, and facilitated important process of reconciliation between Cuban families. The announcement yesterday is, of course, much broader than the previous steps taken by the president, so we expect the impact to be even greater.
Expecting the impact to be even greater inside of Cuba, will it eventually undermine the Castros if the channels are completely open, the channels of communication with the United States?
Well, certainly it's better to have Cubans less reliant on the Cuban government than more reliant on the Cuban government. It's better to have Cubans have more access to information and more contact with outside civil society than less. As part of the package yesterday, 53 political prisoners will be released from Cuban jails. So that's another positive development. So I think that the steps taken by the president will certainly help strengthen civil society. That's why the measures that he announced are specifically guided towards empowering civil society there. And I think it's a very positive, and that's why it's been welcomed by Cuban civil society and dissidents on the island.
Did you think Barack Obama had it in him to basically give this speech where he said, we've been applying sanctions for 50 years and they don't work?
Well, that certainly, I think, was he's said before, so it's a reiteration of things he said in the past. I think what of a lot of us who've been advocating for these specific measures he took yesterday for over a year and a half now, none of us expected that he would be as bold as he was and as far-reaching. Even though we believe there's a lot more he could do, we were certainly very satisfied with the steps and the leadership that he took yesterday in turning a page and putting us on a path toward policy that, instead of obsessing with hurting the Cuban government, obsesses with helping the Cuban people.
You're saying there's a lot more he can do. We're a bit fuzzy as to how much the president can do on his own and how much he needs approval from Congress to do.
Well, when the embargo was codified under Helms-Burton, the president preserved executive authority to regulate many of those sanctions. So the president is able, as he did yesterday, to create and expand new categories of travel, of remittances, to a certain extent, of import and export of certain goods. So the president, for example, created 12 categories yesterday of travel, or expanded 12 categories of travel. He could certainly build on that and do more in the future. But the important thing is that the steps the president took yesterday were historic, were very bold, and I think will have been met very positively by people inside Cuba, including human rights defenders, and it's because we all agree that there are steps in the right direction to helping Cubans become less dependent on the Cuban government. That's why expectations rising in Cuba is so important.
All right, after a half-century freeze, I put the question to Chris Gillette in Havana. Let me put it to you. How different will Cuba be?
Well, changes in Cuba are important and they're significant, but of course they're not as fast and as big as all of us would like. But that's, of course, isn't for us to decide. We can only either help facilitate those processes of change or make those processes of change more difficult. And I think that President Obama took a big step yesterday to facilitating those processes of change and making it easier for Cuba to adopt bigger and more important reforms, and for the Cuban people to take advantage of those spaces.
How different Cuba will be, how different will the United States be. Stay with us, Tomas Bilbao, because we're going to hear a report now by Josh Vardy.
Cuban cigar is one of the country's biggest exports, but selling them in the U.S. remains illegal. An improvement in U.S.-Cuba relations means this cigar shop in New York is looking forward to the possibility of stocking Cuban-made cigars.
You know, there's a certain mythology to Cuban cigars, so we welcome this as a company. And I, as the manager of our flagship in New York, think it's wonderful for business and for everyone involved.
But cigar exports aren't the only Cuban sector which has the potential to boost the country's economy in the coming years. If the US-Cuba trade embargo is lifted, the flow of capital into the country could be significantly increased.
It'll be easier for Americans to travel to Cuba. It'll be easier for Americans to send money to Cuba. And it will be much easier for Americans to support the emerging private sector, even with trade and capital infusions. All of that should help a rather weak Cuban economy.
Cubans have a range of goods and services they could potentially export to their wealthy neighbor. The US has no nickel, but Cuba has the fourth largest reserves in the world. US medical equipment will be a welcome import, while medicine and medical expertise, particularly in biotechnology, will go the other way. With only 5% of Cuba's population online, the communications sector has potential to grow with US input. And while US President Obama's announcement has authorized the trade of construction materials, further thawing could see US firms brought in to develop Cuba's crumbling infrastructure.
Tomas Bilbao, how much is riding when you see that report when it comes to trade between Cuba and the U.S.?
Well, I think what's important to understand is that the steps that the president took yesterday include, for example, a new limit of $400 that Americans traveling to Cuba are allowed to bring back with them. And that includes $100 for tobacco and alcohol products. And the reason that was included as part of the new regulations was specifically to help support economic activity on the island. So those measures aren't created to create a large export market of Cuba's state-owned enterprises to the United States and stock the shelves of tobacco shops in New York. Rather, they were implemented in order to help fuel the continued growth of independent small businesses on the island.
Not everybody agrees, though. Among those attacking the announcements made on Wednesday, the former governor of Florida and now potential presidential candidate, Jeb Bush, he said that this is only going to benefit, quote, the heinous Castro brothers. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I can't say I'm surprised. The governor has a long history of having a hardline policy on Cuba and of supporting the status quo, a policy of isolation and confrontation with Cuba. I think that we've seen 54 years of that policy has yielded no results. I think that we've seen the positive results that President Obama's policy of engagement, travel, and contact has had with Cuba. And frankly, as a Republican, I believe that that is also important to recognize the freedom of Americans to be able to travel to Cuba and to help their families or help emerging businesses on the island.
And I'm seeing an argument among residents of Florida, divisions within the Cuban American community. It's kind of hard to tell which way they will go in 2016 over this issue.
Well, I think that if you look at the polling that's been conducted over the last few years, it shows an overwhelming majority of Cuban Americans support normalization with Cuba, greater engagement, expansion of travel. In fact, a majority of Cuban Americans in South Florida believe the embargo has been a failure. So I think that while the media is often perhaps 10 to 20 years late on information on the dynamics of the Cuban American community, the realities today is that 500,000 trips are conducted every year by Cuban Americans in South Florida to the island. And of course, that represents more than all the votes that all the Cuban American members of the House of Representatives in Florida received in the last election. So the Cuban American community has already begun its process of normalization with the island, and now remains to be seen if the rest of the country will follow suit.
We're in December of 2014. Is this still going to be an issue in November of 2016?
I suspect that Cuba, as always, will be an issue in a presidential election, but certainly not on the top list of priorities. I think it's a differentiating factor between candidates. I think we've seen that Barack Obama did very well in his first election and, in fact, perhaps beat the Republican candidate in his reelection and as far as Cuban American support in South Florida. So we do see changing dynamics. And frankly, as a Republican, I would like to see people in my party take note of these differences, be on the side of private enterprise, of free enterprise, of individual freedoms, as opposed to, for ideological reasons, simply clinging to a failed policy of last half century.
Tomas Bilbao, there was a front-page editorial in French newspaper Le Figaro this Thursday, in which it said, we've just heard Barack Obama saying a half-century of sanctions on Cuba haven't worked. Why are we ratcheting up sanctions against Russia? Your thoughts on that?
Well, there's two very distinct sanctions regimes. One is a unilateral embargo on Cuba in which no other country participates, which has blanket sanctions that affect the entire country. Another thing that's very different are multilateral sanctions where other important trading partners and world powers participate that are targeted towards specific industries or specific members of the government. And so it's very difficult to compare the unilateral sanctions on Cuba with the sanctions that we're now seeing imposed on Russia.
And when you think that just a month ago we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, why have the Castros stayed in power in Cuba?
Well, you know, that's a difficult question to answer. I think that certainly in the early years of the revolution, people were excited about a prospect of something different that never materialized. And since then, I think the regime has used isolation, has used repression as tools to maintain control. And that's why it's important that President Obama has taken steps to at least break isolation from this side of the Florida Straits to help take away perhaps that tool that the Cuban government has been using for all these years to remain in power. I think that, as your colleague in Havana said, raising expectations are key here, and to the extent the United States can take steps to facilitate processes of change in the island, I think that that's perhaps the most important thing we can do.